welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking one of the most audacious, frankly fascinating, and ultimately dangerous frauds in the entire history of Silicon Valley. We're going to look at exactly how a 19-year-old college dropout built a completely fake empire worth billions, managed to fool some of the most powerful people in America, and worst of all, put real human lives at risk.
Picture this. It's November 18th, 2022. We're inside a federal courtroom in San Jose, California. Standing right there before a judge is a 38-year-old woman in a simple gray dress. Her eyes are red, she's in tears, and her hands are visibly shaking. Now, just 5 years before this, she was the youngest self-made female billionaire in U.S. history. She was gracing the covers of Forbes and Time magazine, literally being compared to Steve Jobs. But on this day, Elizabeth Holmes is sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline to understand how she actually got there. The whole story kicks off in 2003 in a Stanford University dorm room. 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes has this childhood obsession with becoming a billionaire, so she decides to drop out. She takes her parents' education savings and founds a company that eventually becomes Theranos. And man, the ascent was just incredibly rapid. By 2004, she's already secured $500,000 in seed funding. Fast forward to 2010, the company hits that magical $1 billion valuation. And by 2014, Theranos is valued at a staggering $9 billion. But here's the wild part. This entire timeline, it's built on a fundamental impossibility.
Part 1. The Illusion of Success, the $9 billion facade.
The premise behind Theranos was beautifully simple and honestly incredibly emotionally powerful. Think about it. Right now, getting blood work done usually involves big needles, multiple large vials of blood, and waiting days for a lab to process everything. Holmes promised to fix all that with a small desktop device. She claimed it could run 200 different medical tests using just a single drop of blood from a finger prick, giving you results in minutes. It was this massive vision that was going to completely revolutionize medicine and save lives. There was just one tiny, massive problem. The biochemistry just doesn't work that way. A single drop of blood literally does not contain enough material to reliably perform that many accurate tests. It completely defied the fundamental laws of physics and chemistry. But Holmes either didn't know that or, well, she just didn't care.
To sell this impossible technology, Holmes knew she needed a totally unshakable persona. So she brilliantly reverse-engineered this visionary founder character, specifically modeling herself right after Steve Jobs. She adopted the daily uniform, the black turtlenecks. She deliberately lowered her voice, speaking in this deep baritone way below her natural register just to project authority. She'd tell people she slept only 4 hours a night and survived on green smoothies. And when she spoke to you, she maintained this intense, unblinking eye contact that made people feel, extraordinarily seen. It sounds a lot like theater, right? Because it was. But in Silicon Valley, it acted as the ultimate credential.
And that whole persona helped her assemble what has to be the most absurdly overqualified, yet completely medically unequipped corporate board in business history. Just listen to these names. Former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, legendary 4-star Marine General James Mattis. Imagine walking into a boardroom and looking at these absolute geopolitical titans. The optics alone gave the company unquestionable credibility. But here's the crucial point. Almost nobody on this board had any deep expertise in healthcare or laboratory science. They were incredibly impressive on paper, sure, but they were entirely incapable of asking the right technical questions. And all that legitimacy acted like a giant magnet for unprecedented wealth. Holmes was smart. She strategically avoided traditional medical venture capitalists because she knew they would demand actual peer-reviewed data. Instead, she targeted billionaire families and huge media moguls. The Walton family poured in $150 million. Media titan Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The DeVos and Cox families added another $100 million each. We are talking about nearly $1 billion in total capital flooding in. And these investors were prioritizing Holmes' sheer charisma and that illustrious board over rigorous technical due diligence.
Which brings us to part 2, the mechanics of fraud. Hiding the truth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer contrast between the optics and the reality. To protect her secret, Holmes built an unprecedented wall of non-disclosure agreements, locked doors, and strictly banned communication between different departments. When VIP investors came for a demonstration, they'd get a quick finger prick. That drop of blood went into Theranos' signature machine, called the Edison, and minutes later a screen would magically display these comprehensive health results. But the reality? The Edison wasn't doing the analysis at all. Employees were quietly taking that tiny blood sample to back rooms, literally diluting it to make the sample larger, and then running it on standard, off-the-shelf laboratory equipment made by companies like Siemens. They were just flat out faking the results.
Part 3. Real harm, endangering patients.
This is where the story shifts from a wild, white-collar tech fraud into a truly horrifying account of public endangerment. The major turning point was a massive deal with Walgreens. The pharmacy giant actually paid Theranos an initial fee of $140 million to install blood testing wellness centers in 40 of their stores across the country, meaning ordinary Americans could now just walk in, get a finger prick, and receive actual medical diagnostics. But because the Edison machine still didn't work, Theranos was secretly diluting these real patient samples and running them on commercial machines. And this dilution process, it introduced wild, massive errors into the tests of everyday people.
The staggering human cost here cannot be overstated. Tens of thousands of test results handed to real patients were fundamentally flawed. People were being told they were completely healthy when they were actually sick, and sick when they were perfectly healthy. One patient actually received a false positive HIV test. Imagine that. She endured weeks of severe psychological trauma and absolute panic before going to a traditional lab, retesting, and confirming she was perfectly healthy. Other patients got wildly incorrect cholesterol readings, which led to unnecessary medications or totally missed treatments. And Elizabeth Holmes? She knew about all of it. She received the internal warnings from her staff, and she deliberately ignored every single one of them.
Part 4. The Whistleblower and the Fall of Theranos.
A wall of secrecy built on that many laws can only hold up for so long. The cracks finally started to show thanks to a 23-year-old biology graduate named Tyler Schultz. Now, Tyler was actually the grandson of board member George Schultz. While working there, Tyler noticed that quality control data was being completely faked and that patients were getting bad results. His escalation process is honestly terrifying. Step 1, he tries raising concerns internally, but management just dismisses him as young and naive. Step 2, he goes directly to his grandfather's house to plead with him in person, but George Schultz literally sides with Elizabeth Holmes over his own grandson. Left completely isolated, Tyler takes step 3, risking his freedom and his family relationships to secretly contact John Carreyrou, a 2-time Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal.
The fallout from that turned into an intense psychological thriller. Theranos deployed this incredibly aggressive intimidation playbook to crush Tyler, his fellow whistleblower Erica Chung, and the Wall Street Journal. They hired David Boies, who is widely known as one of the most feared and powerful trial lawyers in America. These whistleblowers were stalked, they were surveilled, and they were constantly threatened with life-threatening lawsuits. Tyler Schultz was targeted so heavily that his parents actually had to spend over $400,000 in legal fees just to defend him. The immense pressure on them to just stay silent was absolutely unimaginable.
But against all odds, the whistleblowers and John Carreyrou did not back down. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal finally dropped the bomb. An article titled "A Prize Startup Struggles" hit the presses. It completely exposed that Theranos was not using its own technology for the vast majority of its tests, relying instead on traditional machines, and it documented this severe internal culture of fear and faked data. It was an absolute earthquake in Silicon Valley.
The sheer velocity of the collapse was staggering. Holmes tried to fight back on national television, but it was over. Federal regulators swooped in. They found conditions posing immediate jeopardy to patient health and completely revoked the company's lab licenses. Back in 2015, Forbes had estimated Holmes' net worth at $4.5 billion. By 2016, they updated that number to exactly 0. The Walgreens partnership evaporated overnight. The high-profile board resigned, and investors just had to sit there and watch nearly $1 billion vanish into thin air.
Part 5. The Blind Spot. How they were fooled.
Holmes and her business partner, Sunny Balwani, were both eventually sentenced to over a decade in prison. But that leaves us with this really uncomfortable question. How were so many smart people fooled? Well, the Theranos scandal perfectly exposes the anatomy of a massive blind spot. First, you have the cult of the visionary founder. Investors wanted to believe the charismatic, emotional narrative so badly, they ignored the lack of peer-reviewed data. Second, Holmes specifically targeted investors who lacked the medical expertise to actually catch her lies. Third, Silicon Valley's whole fake-it-till-you-make-it culture really blurred the lines between having an optimistic product roadmap and committing outright criminal fraud. And finally, Theranos ruthlessly exploited a major FDA regulatory loophole known as laboratory-developed tests, which allowed them to run diagnostics on real humans without getting proper governmental approval for their actual machines.
Today, the physical Edison machines are literally sitting in museums as artifacts of fraud. But the legacy of the company, it has fundamentally rewired healthcare investing. The phrase "another Theranos" has become this permanent shorthand in Silicon Valley for any startup whose claims wildly outpace its reality. Because of this scandal, venture capital firms now absolutely demand rigorous, independent validation and peer-reviewed data. The era of just saying "trust me" in a medical startup is officially dead.
Ultimately, the deepest lesson here isn't just about Elizabeth Holmes or even Silicon Valley. It's about human psychology. The smartest, most powerful people in the world completely suspended their critical judgment because they desperately wanted the story to be true. A young visionary democratizing healthcare? It was intoxicating. So we have to ask ourselves, in a culture that constantly demands more innovation, more progress, and more disruption, are we still forgetting to ask the most basic question of all? Is it actually true? If this story shocked you, make sure to share this explainer with anyone who needs to understand how the incredible mechanics of innovation can sometimes mask the darkest of deceptions. Thanks for learning with us today, and as always, keep asking the right questions.